Right, so this is going to be sort of impromptu, but also sort of very extensively. So, hi. It's been a while, and I don't think I've ever done this. I'm going to get into the scripted part now. So, before we get into the meat of this video, I'd just like to say, hi, give you a quick update on this channel. I'm extremely bad at being disciplined, and I just, mostly, since I changed the name and the content of the channel, I've been making little short, jokey videos, I feel like 2 years. Anyway, I'd like to stop doing that and then take a slower outlook to content. And I like to move a little bit more into criticism and in-depth analysis of media, films, books, see them with a bit more of a critical lens. And where better to start that than with a film that I haven't ever seen and don't really plan on seeing. So a little while back, they being I don't know who, announced that Noah Baumbach would be directing an adaptation of Don DeLillo's absolutely seminal novel White Noise. And it's coming out this year, so I figured I'd talk about it this year. And I love this. It's great. It's funny. It's bleak. It's insightful. I mean, if you haven't read White Noise already, you absolutely should. It's sensational. And in theory, if Noah Baumbach gets more people to read the book through his film, it could be an absolute win. But that's in theory. In practice, or maybe still in theory, honestly, it's a failure of the novel to adapt it into a movie, and here's why. So before we get into why the film is by default bad, I'm going to refresh you very quickly, or I'll just tell you the plot synopsis of White Noise. And this is very basic rundown of the essential elements, right? So please, again, just read the book. Anyway, White Noise essentially follows Jack Gladney, a college professor teaching Hitler studies at the College on the Hill. That's actually what the college is called. The College on the Hill. So, the first third or so, I think, of the novel, the first part, it's just a bunch of random episodes in his life, involving, his family, his wife, his children and stepchildren, and his assorted college colleagues. Some notable scenes for developing our understanding of the thematic content of the book in this first part. It's called Waves and Radiation in the book. Are the interactions between Jack and Babette, his wife, who are both obsessed with who will die first between the two. There's a scene where Jack and a notable colleague, Murray Siskin, travel to the most photographed barn in America, where Murray philosophizes about how no one really sees the barn and how it's impossible to see the barn after seeing the signs on the road ahead of the barn advertising it as the most photographed barn in America. There's also a bunch of episodes where a bunch of strange guys in mylar suits, they start combing through buildings, and then they die of chemical radiation. And there's a few chapters where the family, they sit down to sort of watch car crash documentaries and natural disasters on the TV, which is actually described in the novel as mind-numbing. And I think you'll begin to start seeing why it might be a little hypocritical to make a big budget Netflix movie about this novel, right? I'll keep going on with the second part, the part that I very much expect the film to focus on. It's called The Airborne Toxic Event. And in this part, a rail car transporting a chemical derails, causing a cloud of gas to cover the college and its surrounding town. In this part, Jack himself is actually exposed to this chemical, and he worries about his death. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because the part's just basically plot momentum, and there aren't a whole lot of things actually related to like the big ideas that it's trying to push. But there are still some, but I'll talk about it later because we need to get on to part 3, Dilemma, which is a little bit more difficult to describe, so I'll just do the absolute most basic things and explain the rest in depth later. So Dillo is a drug that staves off the fear of death, but it's also highly addictive. So the 2 characters we are introduced to in the book that take it, they become addicted quite quickly. Eventually, Jack finds out that who she's getting it from, and for reasons that I can't get into here, he decides to kill him. He sort of organises a meeting between Babette and the man, and drives to the meeting place with a gun that his father-in-law gave him. He then confronts the man, Mr. Gray. He's actually a Dilla-addicted man called Willie Mink, and he shoots him twice in the chest. He then absolutely fails to do his plan, which was to shoot him 3 times in the chest and then put the gun in his hand. But he shoots him twice and puts the gun in his hand and gets shot in the arm. I should also mention at this point it's been revealed that the drug doesn't actually work, and it just makes you addicted and unable to distinguish words from action. So the example given in the book is like if someone has a speeding bullet, then the person would duck to the floor, right? So anyway, after he shoots Gray and gets shot in the arm, Jack has a change of heart, and he sort of takes the Gray to a hospital where he talks to an atheist nun, and basically after that, it's hard to explain, but the novel cuts to his youngest child rides a tricycle across a freeway and he survives. More on this later, I guess. With the very final passage of the novel being about the safety and warmth of the supermarket and how everyone hates checking out or something. So that's my extremely abridged rundown of the plot. And at this point, probably wondering, so what? This video is supposed to be about the adaptation and how it's inadequate by default. And why is that, right? Well, it all lies in the themes of the book, and specifically the main idea that this book is trying to tell us. But before we get to that, let's lay down the facts about the novel and the production of the film. And I reckon at this point, people who've read the book will see what I'm getting at, sort of, especially if you've read it recently. But stick with me, because I promise it is actually going somewhere. So, White Noise was published in 1985 by Viking Press. It's Don DeLillo's 8th book, and it went through like 29 names before being published under the name White Noise. The most famous example of this is when the Panasonic Corporation objected to the book being called Panasonic, and that's extremely as ironic as we'll come to see. It was an immediate critical darling. It won the year's National Book Award. Critics and audiences alike loved it for its witty, sharp writing, and honestly, it's really great critique on society. And it pushed Don DeLillo into the spotlight with his follow-up novels Libra, Mao 2, and Underworld, cementing his reputation as a titan of post-war literary canon. Now, I must confess that I haven't read Mao 2, and I'm currently reading Underworld, and I certainly plan to read Mao 2. I'm only about halfway through Underworld though, so I won't make comments on them, but if you enjoyed reading White Noise, they're obviously the natural next step, and since I have read Libra, I can tell you it is absolutely excellent, and you should read it as well. White Noise sort of falls under the literary movement of like postmodernism, which so many people have talked about, and it's too broad a topic for me to really cover in this video. So just look it up for yourself, okay? But keep that in mind, right? Keep in mind that it is very heavily associated with other postmodernist novels. And now let's talk about the movie, I guess. The movie, which premiered in the 2022 Venice Film Festival as the opener, it was directed by Noah Baumbach, who also notably directed some other movies, probably. I think he's best known for his divorce duology, Squid and the Whale and Marriage Story, and his collaborations with other less aggressively mediocre directors. It's like his wife Greta Gerwig, who directed Lady Bird and Little Women, which is actually a really good example of how to adapt a classic novel. And he's also known for screenwriting the worst Wes Anderson film, and a children's film. I should also put forward first that I don't think he's an especially good director, but that's my personal taste. No shade to him if you like him. He's just not my thing. I will be throwing him under the bus though, like a few times. So I'm not insulting your personal taste when I say that he's bad. I just don't like him. Anyway, he's directing and I believe writing a film which is going to star Adam Driver, of course, as Jack, Greta Gerwig as Babette, Don Cheadle as Murray Siskind, and Jodie Turner-Smith as another colleague, Winnie Richards. It was produced by A24 and Heyday Films and was distributed by Netflix. With an estimated budget of $80 million, it marks his largest ever budget for an adaptation of White Noise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Why am I so predisposed to discard this film? Well, as promised, I'm going to dive into the main ideas of White Noise, and I'll be doing a brief rundown of some things while focusing more on others for reasons that I hope will become clear as we go along. Without further delay, here's what White Noise is actually trying to tell us. So the book tends to split its three core ideas into different chapters. So, for example, one chapter will be about one theme and then another about a different theme. So, let me just get on to the three key ideas of the book. They are, in no particular order, death, the media, and consumer culture. So let's start out with death, because it's absolutely pivotal to the narrative and to the majority of White Noise. And it appears on nearly every page. It's the main point of conversation between the majority of the major characters. They're always talking about death. There's always something going on with death. A large plot point is Jack's fear of dying. His reasoning for trying to kill Gray is to alleviate his fear of death. It's just a whole thing. Anyway, this obsession that the book and its characters have with death is sort of the main idea, and it ties into the other two major points that the novel's trying to make. So I'll just run through how they connect now, and we'll put a pin in death right now. These are really, really the linchpins of my whole argument against the film. But I think they're based pretty solidly, I'd argue, and I hope you'll agree. So anyway, when you read a fair few novels from the latter half of the 20th century, especially those from the 1980s, you start to sort of notice a few of them have a real obsession with this really weird distrust in media and television especially. It's especially prevalent in postmodernism, which again you're going to have to look it up. I think the distrust of television and media, and I'll get into the reasons why they were very distrustful of this later, but right now you just need to know that White Noise is a very well-known example of this absolute distrust in all forms of media. Reading the book, you see that characters are basically slaves to their televisions and radios. There's a running sort of joke is that the characters only refer to the airborne toxic event, the chemical spill, as the name that the radio has most recently referred to it as. So they'll call it the gaseous plume, and then eventually they call it the airborne toxic event, and without fail they'll always call it that. You know, half the conversations in the book are like literally just people basing their lives around pop culture. If you need proof, I have an extensive wealth of quotes, honestly.
Okay, I'm too lazy to put these up on screen, but I'm just gonna read them out. This is like a month after I've done the rest of it, so about in the first part of the book, there's a lecture between Jack and Murray on Elvis and Hitler and how that sort of intertwines. I can't be bothered to get the quote up, to be honest. I'm really lazy. Anyway, then we have the thing about the most photographed barn, and I've already talked about that. And so here's another thing in the book. When the airborne toxic event happens, the characters refer to it first as a cloud, then a plume, then the event. But basically the gist of it is that everything they hear on the stereo is what they'll call it. So they never call it anything other than what they hear. Now, there's a bunch of things about car crashes on television and how decent, respectable people will get caught up in car crashes. Got another one, it's whenever there are two places in most people's life, their homes, they're where they live, and their television screens. Yeah, so that's look, the idea is that they do have a lot of things to do with media, and Donald does not like that. I mean, I'm really lazy, so I can't really show that, but you get the gist, hopefully.
I'm going to need you to hold on for a second before I really connect the three main ideas, because I'm about to explain the most major idea in the book. And you see, the core of white noise is neither of those things. People say it's the death is the core. We'll get back to that. But consumerism and consumer culture is absolutely the core. The film wants to make a major statement about consumer culture, that as the audience, and the audience being the readers of the 1980s, we are completely saturated in this. And so it sort of like intertwines death and consumerism. It really equates them to each other. It's really clever, because you see, in white noise, death is the end of the transaction. It's when we can't consume anymore. It's why the characters are obsessed so much over death, because they are defined by what they consume. Towards earlier, the characters are having a particularly bad episode where they have massive fears of death, and so they go on a family shopping trip, and they say they feel so powerful, they feel like they can control life and death itself. In death, they can no longer have their important hair, they can't no longer lecture on who is better, Elvis or Hitler, and they can't feel big anymore. They have no control over when death comes, and so they're naturally afraid of it. Now, naturally, many people have actually interpreted this the other way around, that like consumerism is meant to be an escape from death, and the novel is about how we'll do anything to avoid death. But I don't think that this interpretation fundamentally understands one of the absolutely great strengths of the book, that being its ability to hold the mirror up to the audience and present it as a monster. Let me explain what I mean by that, obviously. Throughout the book, nothing, particularly unbelievable happens. There isn't a moment where anything that couldn't technically feasibly happen happens. In fact, white noise continually mocks the idea that there's a greater purpose for all these characters, with obviously the most notable example being the poisonous snake subplot, where one of Jack's sons, Heinrich's friends, is determined to break the world record for the longest amount of time spent in a cage filled with 27 poisonous snakes. This pops up throughout the book, I believe, and it comes to a head in the final part. The whole subplot is just like a microcosm of the main point that the book is trying to make, and Oren, the friend, serves as a direct parallel to Jack. the reason he's such a great parallel is because he's completely unfazed by death, and we never see him anywhere outside of the house. You never see him out shopping. He's a direct parallel, and it's called multiple times throughout the book. But anyway, here's how it comes to a head in part 3.
I stopped to ask whether Aura stood into the cage yet. They said it wasn't humane. There was no place that they would let him do it officially. He had to go underground. Where's underground? Waterton. Orriston's trainer. They found a public notary there who said he would certify a document that said that Oris Mercador spent so many days incarcerated with these venomous reptiles, blah blah blah. Where would they find a large glass cage in Watertown? They wouldn't. What would they find? A room in the only hotel. Plus there were only 3 snakes and he got bit in 4 minutes. You mean the hotel let them place poisonous snakes in the room? The hotel didn't know. The man who arranged the snakes carried them up in an airline bag. It was a whole massive deception, except the man showed up with 3 snakes instead of the agreed 27. In other words, he told them he had access to 27 snakes. Venomous, except they weren't, so Horace got bit for nothing. A jerk. They had all this anti-venom they couldn't even use. The first 4 minutes.
I mean, you add to this the numerous tabloids that pop up throughout the book. They're laden with sensationalist garbage about psychic predictions, and it's extremely clear that Don DeLillo finds it absolutely laughable that these guys could have a purpose, written in the stars for them, that anything supernatural or strange could even happen. Anyway, back to what I was actually saying. So basically, the book is about ordinary, slightly pathetic people getting entangled in mundane and sometimes less mundane affairs. And, White Noise has sort of 2 things about this, that this is, number one, that this is essentially how our society works, people milling about day-to-day consuming at shops, all that stuff. And number 2, that is utterly horrifying. And when it shows ourselves in this really mundane way, and it tells us to be absolutely disgusted by it and disturbed by how unreal it sounds. And, to change, we naturally push against this narrative, and that's where I think that interpretation of death being the major idea of the novel comes from. And I reckon as readers of the 1980s, the moral majority, Reagan, they must have especially felt very uncomfortable with this idea that, our consumerist ways are killing death. And naturally, of course, the dominant interpretation of the text is now what we'll do to forget about how we're inevitably going to die. Escaping our fear of it, consuming, and they don't miss that we have already killed death by making it another transaction and making it the end of the transaction. We've completely subsumed it. The only reason we're still afraid is that death will bring an end to our spending. It's not a lurking, creeping thing that could happen to anyone at any time. It is insolvency. It's the inability to continue purchasing. It's being bankrupt. It's being not able to continue shopping. We never see any one person die in White Noise. The closest we come to that is seeing a man presumably financially wrecked by his crippling drug addiction, Mr. Grey, being shot twice in the chest, only to be brought back from the brink of death by a hospital. And why? Because they're Americans, because they're middle-class academics, they're representatives, they're corporate spokespeople, stay-at-home wives, because their money is more important, fundamentally, than their life. Literally, in the book's final sentence, literally the last thing, the final thing the audience is expected to take out of it is a chilling statement. It's a statement that has been building up to since the very start. The tabloids reappear, and this time no headlines appear. We're just simply told of their existence and their contents as interpreted by Jack out with the family on a shopping trip. The final sentence, it reads as follows. Let me get it out. I've had the book here this whole time. This is where we wait together, regardless of age, our cart stocked with brightly coloured goods. A slowly moving line, satisfying, giving us time to glance at the tabloids in the racks. Everything we need that is not food or love here is in the tabloid racks. The tales of the supernatural and the extraterrestrial, the miracle vitamins, the cures for cancer, the remedies for obesity, the cults of the famous and the dead. After reading this, I'm not even sure how anyone can think that Noah Baumbach was justified in making a movie out of this. And I have to question his media literacy. Here, Don DeLillo so perfectly summates the havoc that the media, consumerism, and our own greed wreak upon us, our children, and generations to come, and he never provides any visual to us. And these are tabloids, you see them every day at your supermarket. They're raving about the royal family, about celebrity divorce, and what Don DeLillo sees in them is complete cultural rot. It's an industry designed to distract us from our lives. Completely manufactured consent. It's an absolute indictment of everything that Noah Baumbach's film, a big budget Oscar bait Netflix produced slop pile, participating in the exact thing it tries to comment on. It's a pure distillation of unconscious consumerism at its worst, and it's yet another example of just cognitive dissonance as well. No, that was a really rough segue, but remember what I said about coming back to the 1980s and why the postmodernist authors railed against the media, or what Noam Chomsky called manufactured consent. His book of the same name, and with the subtitle Political Economy of the Mass Media, has ever since its publication become absolutely more and more true, depressingly enough. But what the book has actually tried to warn us against, and this has been obscured in the years since, was the idea of media brainwashing, the idea that the media constantly run meaningless, vapid stories about celebrities, psychics, and especially like sport, and they select news stories in order to push a political agenda. I mean, to demonstrate why this is absolutely true, I will now show you some Sky News articles. To anyone that is an Australian watching, that's like Fox News, but slightly less terrible.
Twisted for ladies. Susan Hussey's questions to be interpreted as racist. Barack Obama throws shade at Joe Biden during rally. Lefties losing it. Canadian Army veteran offered euthanasia instead of chairlift. Royal family prepared for any outright lies and inaccuracies in Meet and Harry Docker. It's really hard for millennials to see conservatism as a viable option.
That probably didn't make a lot of sense if you weren't Australian, but my point is that it's political propaganda. Now, I should stress that this happens all... You know what? I was about to say it happens all across the political spectrum, but I'm not even going to lie to you. It's right wing, mostly, honestly, because surprise, surprise, media magnets they want a lot of money, and you don't get much money if you have to pay tax, do you? Anyway, rant aside, is basically what DeLillo is getting at. But the implication of white noise is not so much that they push a political agenda, but the media pushes an agenda of carelessness, of unconscious consumerism, and this agenda sustains them and us in this vicious manipulation of our base desires. DeLillo therefore posits that not only does the media position us in their agenda, but the media encourages and feeds our most self-destructive impulses, our most base, greedy selves, and that they have contributed more than any of us to the death of death. And before I go back into that idea, I just want to mention another thing that contributed to this whole manufacturing consent within the media was the advent of the 24-hour news cycle, and that's why a lot of people rail against it. So for those of you that you don't know, back before the 1980s, TV news was relegated to like hour-long spots 2 or 3 times a day, and without the internet, newspapers obviously only published like an issue every day, I think, or so, about that. And so you'd only really get the important events of the day. But that all changed on June 1, 1980, with the first broadcast of American channel CNN, the very first news station to broadcast news 24 hours a day. Following this, a few other channels started to pop up, and around the time of the O.J. Simpson trial, it really picked up. But that's not really relevant to us because it happened like a decade later, after White Noise was published. Anyway, with these news stations running 24/7, obviously there are only like slow news days, and you can test this yourself by looking at any news channel on like a particularly slow day. You probably can't do it now with the US midterms in America and other stuff coming on in everywhere. But anyway, they literally basically run whatever, celebrity gossip, like poorly researched moral panic. I mean, you name it, they'll run it, right? And these stations being profit-driven just inevitably leads us back to White Noise, where consumerism runs rampant and tabloids control what we think, basically. Another thing I just want to quickly mention is the political landscape of the 1980s, because it also plays like a major factor in why Don DeLillo is so opposed to consumerism, and that's because very much that was the emergence of neoliberalism, idealistic, beatniks, peaceniks, the hippies of the 60s and 70s. They succumbed to the deeply materialistic and individualistic undercurrents of those movements, and the realpolitik became increasingly more capitalist and almost fascistic in nature. This is exemplified especially by the two most well-known neoliberal leaders, Reagan and Thatcher. These two permanently altered the trajectories of their respective countries, with many of the ramifications still being felt today. Probably most notably, every economic problem going on in Britain, practically any problem that you can suggest as pertains to economics, you can almost directly trace most bad things back to these two people, honestly. Here's some videos, I guess. I haven't really researched it, but I haven't researched any videos, but I can tell you that they did a lot of bad things. Anyway, we ranted about how they're bad over. Let's get back to White Noise. So I hope I've outlined my reasoning for disliking Baumbach's White Noise on principle, but when it's all said and done, it's something that just didn't sit well with me as I was writing this, and I just have to ask, why was it that I was so mad about this movie adapting this one book? Why is it that in this specific instance it doesn't sit right with me? I have absolutely no problem with other anti-consumerist films. In fact, I really love some of them. I recently watched Repo Man. It was really good. You should watch it. But aren't these films fundamentally undermining their messages by being consumable films? To be played in packed theaters, you literally have to consume to get into. And what sets these apart from White Noise? And I do have a few thoughts in my head about this, and so I'll explain them to you probably in the order that I had them. Firstly, on the matter of anti-consumerist film literature especially, a quote that's really been doing the rounds lately is there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. That quote's silly. It advocates for us to unthinkingly consume as much as we want, but it is true. There is very little. It's not to say that there's no way to ethically consume, but it is made more and more difficult by the day, because at some point during the production of literally anything, you can probably trace it back to something unethical. And why do I mention this, you might ask? Because White Noise is a commercial good, the book. In a legal context, it needs to be bought in order to be read, unless you're pirating it, which is illegal. But it's likely, in fact, it's definitely true that the book is made unethically. I mean, it's certainly unethically made because deforestation, paper comes from trees. We cut down trees. That's pretty unethical in my book. This is true every other anti-consumerist artwork. I mean, in the words of like Adrian Brody's character in The French Dispatch, all artists sell all their work. That's what makes them artists. So, why does white noise rub me so wrong? Despite this being true of like all art? Is it just because I dislike Noah Baumbach? And I think that's part of it, but I do have a specific answer to this, so just bear with me for a moment. Now, if it's alright, can you think back to when I had a rant about why the message of white noise is in direct opposition to the film? Remember what I said? How I described the film? I think I used the term Oscar bait, and while I'm sure I don't have to explain what Oscar bait is, I should probably explain why I think white noise is Oscar bait. And to do that, we do actually, unfortunately, have to talk about Noah Baumbach. So Noah Baumbach is a director, apparently, and over the course of writing this video, I've seen some of his movies, or I should say I've tried to watch some of his movies. Earlier I did say that he was aggressively mediocre. I wrote that like 2 months ago, having only encountered him as like a writer on 2 Wes Anderson movies, with mediocre writing. I have since completely revised my opinion on this guy. He's terrible. He's really bad. He's so bad. He's stupendously inept at writing the most basic dialogue. His camera, the way he views his subjects is so superfluous, because they describe everything they're doing on screen all the time. His plotting is terrible. It's scattershot, it's trite, it's inept. He's not good. It might work to be scattershot in like a quirky Wes Anderson road trip comedy, like The Life Aquatic, which is just a bad movie as well, by the way. But it doesn't work in anything more consequential than like Fantastic Mr. Fox. It's almost impossible for me to describe just how incredibly bad he is, and what I don't like about his work, because it's just everything. The flow of his dialogue is constantly undercut by stupidly unfunny lines that sound like they were delivered by an AI. His lines sound extremely, like, barely human. They sound like they were written by a robot, and every single time a dialogue happens, I guess, that grinds the entire scene to a halt, to the point where it feels like you're watching a 10-hour train wreck. One might say an airborne toxic event. But his characters are just terrible too. I don't like him at all. But that's my personal opinion. If you do like him, I guess. I just don't like him. Anyway, that's my opinion. But what is not an opinion is that he's absolutely slobberingly desperate for an Oscar. Every single movie he makes falls into a category of movies that are mass-produced to manufacture as many awards out of the Academy as possible. The divorce movie, a movie about absentee father, movie about coming of age, movie about something, another divorce movie. Divorce movies have won the Oscars like 50 times. Of course he wants to make one of those. In the trailer for White Noise, he's like Academy Award nominee Noah Baumbach, and I know that's a common practice, but it annoys me more because obviously he had to have it put there. The painful obvious fact of it is that White Noise is another grovelling attempt to, please Academy, give me an award so I can finally legally say that I'm an Academy Award winner, and that's why the film doesn't sit well with me. The Academy Awards, the Academy itself is the exact type of establishment that White Noise is the most critical of. It's a faceless mass of people being paid off by massive corporations. Here's the source. To trick the public into watching corporatized cinematic universes, basically. And, while I think the Academy Awards I think the Academy Awards a fine institution. I don't think they particularly cause any harm. making white noise into a film to pander to this manufacturing consent algorithm almost. It's the exact behaviour that the book condemns. So I think I'll leave you with a quote from Thomas Pynchon's finally, which I somehow haven't brought up until now. I'll read that one too. I think it sums up my point about TV and media in general. I'll read it out for you. Whole problem with your folks' generation, Isaiah opined. Nothing personal, as you believed in your revolution, put your lives right out there for it, but you shouldn't understand much about the tube. The minute the tube got hold of you folks, that was it. The whole alternative America, El Dedo Mito, sold it all to your real enemies, and even in $1970, it was way too cheap. I'd like to thank everyone who watched the video this far, and, thanks, right? I'm not sure if it went across very well, but I certainly did not have fun scripting or filming it, but I needed to get something off my chest about this film. I plan to maybe talk about Vineland itself actually, at some point, because I think it's really overlooked in the canon, because it's a phenomenal book and you should all read it, seriously, all read Vineland. I'm not sure what to say. Thank you for watching, and give it a subscribe or something. See you all in 10 months when I decide that I'm finally going to do something again.